Everybody, welcome to Colorado Inside Out. I'm your host, Dominic Dezzutti. Thank you for joining us. Let's get a quick take on the Republican gubernatorial debate hosted by the Denver Post on Tuesday, which did not include Tom Tancredo or Scott Gessler. Reports surfaced this week that Gessler and Tancredo may consider debates later in the primary season if the field narrows. Meanwhile, Ronnie Bell Sylvester became the first woman to join the GOP primary earlier this week, right after the debate. Patricia Calhoun from Westword, a lot to chew on here. What do you think?
Well, I think Gessler and Tancredo would both be smart to get into the debate. People like to see them. They don't have to. Their excuse that they don't want to weaken the Republicans' chances by attacking each other, there's an easy solution to that. They don't have to attack the other candidates. And if they challenge the other candidates not to attack them, then we'll know who's in the mood to be nice or not. Ronnie Bell Sylvester is an interesting entry. I think she's got a very uphill battle, but she certainly represents rural interests. Her husband is Chuck Sylvester of the Stock Show, so she knows rural issues.
David Kopel from the Independence Institute and DU Law School. What did you make of the debate?
I think it showed that the second tier of the Republican candidates is pretty strong. And if Gessler or Tancredo were not the nominee, you can go into that lesser group of, in name recognition now, group of four and come out with somebody pretty strong. As Ed Seelover mentioned recently, the governor's office fears Mike Kopp more than anybody else, and I think Greg Brophy and House both showed that they've got something that has the potential to make for a strong candidacy.
Penfield Tate, longtime state lawmaker and attorney with Greenberg Traurig. If Gessler and Tancredo said they weren't going to debate and then suddenly decide to debate if they're the only two left, is that flip-flopping or just sound strategy?
It's both. It's flip-flopping, it's sound strategy, and it's common sense. And to what both Patty and David said, I think Gessler and Tancredo need to get in the debates. They'll be perceived as arrogant and above it all, potentially, by voters if they don't. Secondly, this second tier of candidates that David described, one of them may quickly become a top-tier challenger for the nomination if folks decide they can just take a pass and they're above it all. And Patty's right. You avoid weakening your ultimate nominee by playing nice. Talk about issues and not about people, and you ought to be fine.
Natasha Gardner, senior editor with 5280 Magazine, wrap it up for us.
Well, I think what's interesting with all of this is it's showing that the GOP is not following the usual playbook. Tancredo nominated himself essentially as the contender, and Gessler looked at it and said, oh, well, I should be too. And then kudos to particularly Kopp for coming out and saying, all right, guys, come back and play in the playground. This is an election system, and we have to do some things correctly. So it'll be interesting to see what other tricks they have up their sleeves before this is done.
It should be a fun primary season. A legal challenge to Colorado's same-sex marriage ban was filed by 9 couples in Denver District State Court this week. The couples have stated that Colorado's refusal to allow them to marry denies their rights and treats them as second-class citizens. The move follows similar lawsuits in other states, some of which have been successful in overturning gay marriage bans. Patty, what are the chances of this lawsuit succeeding?
Well, I guess the real race will be, will the lawsuit succeed before federally gay marriage is recognized? This passed in 2006 when Colorado voted to ban the possibility of gay marriage. And it's so interesting because I don't think now, in 2014, the same ban would pass. It makes me think of Amendment 2 back in 1993 when people voted, basically, we became the hate state because we voted essentially no special rights for gays, which really meant not equal rights. So I think we'll see, this will have to be a challenge to the Constitution. They will have to find it unconstitutional. Depends if the court does find it unconstitutional, depends on how much the state is going to want to appeal it. We remember in '93, the state had to still challenge the unconstitutionality of the hate state because it had been passed by the voters of Colorado. So in this case, they would probably have to do it too. But I think the odds are good that we might see action from on the federal level before this ever is settled.
David, what do you think about that? Is this part of that momentum towards a federal decision, or will Colorado make some momentum on this race just because of this particular lawsuit?
It's a smart legal move, and on a parallel track. The 10th Circuit Court of Appeals will be hearing this year appeals from decisions by federal district courts in Oklahoma and Utah, where those federal courts said the United States Constitution does create a right to gay marriage. I think that's a far-fetched legal theory, but obviously some other judges don't. And so the 10th Circuit will resolve that. There's no point in starting another federal case in about Colorado's law. The Colorado plaintiffs are going into state court, which can still rule on federal constitutional issues. And there's one issue they have to their advantage, which the plaintiffs in Oklahoma and Utah did not. As I predicted, Colorado, by passing the civil unions law and saying if you're gay, you can have a civil union, which is, by law, exactly like marriage in every possible respect, except you can't say the word marriage. In connection to it, that they can say, well, as a federal law, put aside whether there's a hidden gay rights amendment in the U.S. Constitution, all laws by the Equal Protection Clause have to meet a minimum standard of rationality. And what exactly is the rationality of you can do everything the same, except you can't use a particular word when you do it one way rather than the other? So I think that, and I think they've got a very solid chance of success of winning that federal claim in the Colorado state courts.
Penn, approaching this issue, there are some folks that believed maybe going to the ballot. I mean, obviously times have changed since 2006. Civil unions were pretty much supported, I think, publicly with polls, things like that. But then there's this way of going via the lawsuit. Which do you think is easier and has the chance of being more successful?
I think the path that these plaintiffs have chosen is the easier one and the smarter path right now. Although I agree with Patty that I think if the 2006 ballot question were on the Colorado ballot now, it would fail. And I think that was reflected when we saw the big brouhaha in the State House over civil unions. And it actually, I think, directly led to a shift in control in the Colorado State House. The other thing the plaintiffs, I think, have going for themselves here is even if federal law doesn't change or a federal decision isn't imminent, the more cases that precede theirs, what you begin to build is a body of decisions that reach the same conclusion in a variety of different ways. So that by the time this thing gets into the appellate process, you know, when you're the proponents for overturning this ban, you've got a bunch of different successful cases out there, the theories of which you can draw upon potentially to put in front of a court here to simply strengthen your case. So I think the approach these folks have taken is the right political approach for what they want to accomplish now.
Natasha, your thoughts on this new lawsuit?
Well, I think what's interesting about the lawsuit is that this is a necessary process for same-sex marriages being approved in Colorado, which and it's worth stepping back and saying 17 states in the United States already have legalized this. So I think that the whole country is moving in that direction. But while there is a legal fight, there's also just a day-to-day basic human rights fight as well. And you know, I think that recently we've heard a lot of headlines about Michael Sam, who's the NFL player who's admitted, who's come out and said, I'm gay, and you know that before the draft. And it's been very interesting to see that dialogue that goes around that, both positive and negative, because it shows how far we have to come to maybe meet up with where the court is going to end up. We have a long way to go before that happens.
Governor John Hickenlooper's office released his budget proposal this week that included optimistic projections for revenue from the sale of recreational pot. The budget estimates represent a significant increase from prior projections, predicting over $134 million to come into state coffers over the next fiscal year. David, are these numbers too optimistic, or were they too pessimistic 6 months ago?
I think that whatever the projections in the past, it's reason for optimism in the future. I mean, this shows that when the voters chose to re-legalize marijuana, to get rid of the ban that had been put in for really racist, anti-Hispanic fear-mongering back in the 30s, we moved over $500 million out of the underground economy and into the legal, regulated economy. And of that, the state is going to get a huge amount of revenue. So 134 million extra dollars. What kind of extra mental health care can you provide for that, which we're very underfunded on? How can you help the public schools? How can you do so many positive things with that money? And remember, the reason alcohol prohibition was finally repealed by the American people was not mainly because of all the terrible civil liberties violations that resulted from it. It was in the Great Depression. They said, wow, we have the opportunity to have a bunch of new jobs and a bunch of tax money since the economy's down, we could have a lot more money for the government to spend. And so the legislature and the governor are starting to get hooked on marijuana revenue, and that is a constructive thing because people were buying marijuana before anyway, and now they're paying taxes on it.
We always knew it was a gateway drug, but we didn't know it this way. Penn, I saw the governor broke down his budget proposal and spent, or at least proposed to spend, a great deal of that extra over $100 million, I think over 88 million of it, on preventing youth from using marijuana, the programs that would do that, and then substance abuse programs, which are great. I think there's probably not a lot of people who would argue against those, but it was a large percentage of that kind of money. You're a former state lawmaker. When your colleagues at the state capitol now look at an extra $100 million, are they going to want to fall right in line with the governor proposed, or will they have their own ideas?
No, this is free found money. So the food fight begins about now. And this is no different than the budget process. Governors propose budgets all the time. And when you're in the legislature, you talk about, the proposed budget. It has nothing to do with reality because the legislature writes the budget that they feel they want to write. So the governor has a proposal, and that's nice. He'll have someone introduce a bill, and then all heck is going to break loose, as it should. That's the appropriate way to do it. You know, this is a fascinating situation because I think we're finding out the original projections were not optimistic enough. They clearly didn't understand the nature in which this habit had become sort of commonplace and almost part of the lifestyle of Colorado. This same report showed that they anticipate revenues from marijuana next year to top $1 billion. That's massive. And I think part of it is the novelty, almost like opening a new Trader Joe's, except now you can buy pot legally. So, everybody's doing it. And maybe the novelty will wear off, maybe it won't. And then you've got the sort of the prohibition effect also. So it's going to be interesting. It's a new revenue stream. I think it's here to stay. And I think you are going to see a lot of debate and a lot of arguing about how much should go to prevention and education, how much should go to fund schools or pre-K-12 or for the developmentally disabled community. All of that is going to be in play because at the end of the day, it's just more revenues to be divided.
Well, I know if any posters come up with the equivalent of $3 Chuck, it's really going to go through the roof, so we'll see what happens. Natasha, when I saw a headline, an extra $100 million, and I realized it all has to do with Colorado estimates and our particular situation. But if I'm a lawmaker thinking about how this whole legalization of marijuana is working in another state, and I see Colorado lawmakers dealing with the problem of an extra $100 million, that might really entice me. Do you think this is going to make an impact on other states?
Absolutely. Why wouldn't they sign on, especially since Colorado has done a really nice job of looking at regulations and setting a standard for how this is going to get rolled out. I think that model is easy for other states to pick up, and why wouldn't they take a bite of that revenue, which will actually make Colorado's revenue go down a little bit as well. Ultimately, there were a few things that I really like to see with Hickenlooper's budget proposal. The first idea that $40 million is going to school construction, that's fantastic. That is a need in our state, and it kind of checks two boxes. The one thing I would like to see more of, though, is that they were putting some money, or he was proposing putting some money towards buzz driving ads. And that's great, and that's fantastic. Drunk driving ads, or anti-drunk driving ads, actually help. But ultimately, we need to find a better system of identifying that and regulating that and policing that. And I would like to see some more funds go into that issue.
Patty, do you think more money will be spent on marijuana-based programs, or will this become a free-for-all for things not even related to the issue?
Well, they've already started talking about doing some programs that would look into driving while buzzed, because the science on it just isn't very strong. And clearly we're going to have so many challenges coming up as people are arrested for driving under the influence of marijuana. So we do need more studies on that. I think that we'll have quite a free-for-all in the legislature. I would like to see some of this money go to mental health. We talked about it last year. That was going to be such an initiative. If we are worried about kids today, yeah, young kids shouldn't be smoking pot, but we also really want to get into the mental health issues. So I do think some of those mandates will be funded by this. We'll lose some money for when other states start legalizing, when Washington comes. We definitely got a bump, if nothing else, from all the national media coming to town and buying it. But I can tell you, it is not, the interest is not abating. I was just in New York, and all my college friends were very upset I didn't bring any cannabis gummy bears for them. And they're all planning on coming to Colorado for a fun vacation.
It's nice to see the tourism growing. It's nice.
Yeah, so it's not just marijuana revenues, but hotels. They might even buy some beers.
Just here's a few of those like that.
Taco Bell.
The growing feud between Secretary of State Scott Gessler and the Joint Budget Committee flared up again this week. Lynn Bartles of the Denver Post reported that Gessler sent a letter to the members of the JBC accusing them of political posturing. The most recent issue at hand is the budget set for the Secretary of State's office. Penn, sometimes folks, when they're running in a campaign, if they spell their name right, it's good publicity. But this has been a lot of publicity about a fight. Is this good for Scott Gessler or negative?
I think on balance, it's probably not very good. Scott, whether deserved or not, and on this show in the past, even I have said there are some things he's been accused of where I don't think he did anything wrong. But the problem is a perception, I think, has grown where people hear his name and they assume controversy. And I think they often assume he's usually wrong, that he's gone off on some tangent. This argument with the JBC is not one you're going to win. As the Secretary of State, you have almost no voice in what the budget looks like, much less the budget for your own office. You really ought to be content with what you get. A governor usually doesn't advocate for you. A treasurer normally doesn't advocate for you. They take what they can get, and inflaming the JBC and some of their legislative colleagues just doesn't advance the cause, when part of the other issue surrounding you is how you manage and use money. So I just think this was a fight Scott should have passed on again. And again, people will start questioning his judgment. You want to run for governor? Really? You want to have this argument with the JBC and send letters? It seems a poor decision at best.
Natasha, what caught my eye is that, well, I think some folks are used to seeing Scott Gessler arguing with folks on the opposite side of the aisle, with Democrats. He raised the ire of a few Republicans in the JBC, which obviously there's a lot of Republican votes he needs, not just one or two in the JBC, but that seemed a little bit different than the past battles.
It does, and it's an interesting problem that Scott has. He has worked so hard at making the Secretary of State office less about the Secretary of State and more about Scott Gessler. The problem is that when you get into battles like this, it really starts to become about your name and personality. So you're going to see some infighting with his party, especially as the GOP fight continues on. One of the things, though, I think is interesting is that the Democrats in particular keep on giving him ability to fight back. And in one of those budget meetings, someone made a reference to wrestling with a pig, and it wasn't meant perhaps in the context that it was Scott Gessler's team ran with it. But my question is, why did the Democrats insist on comparing Gessler to animals? Like, he just runs with it. He loves being called the honey badger. He's sort of loving the media surrounding this swine comment as well, and just come up with a different sort of analogy or metaphor, people.
They certainly have been feeding that, haven't they? Patty, what do you think Gessler takes away from this? Possibly in the primary, will he be seen as the guy fighting the good fight in these kind of issues, or is it a more of a problem when it comes to independent voters who may not be knowing the different details of this particular battle?
Well, it's one thing when you're surprised in a good way about money coming into the state, but it's another thing when you're surprised in a bad way. And Gessler did cut fees now he was trying to make things more streamlined for business, but he needed to figure out that cutting those fees would have an impact on his budget, that they would need more money in the Secretary of State's office. And so that is going to reflect on him if someone takes it as a campaign issue, and we'll see if Republicans are going to attack each other or not. But certainly, it will be an issue if he is the Republican. If he's the Republican, because Hickenlooper can say he has worked hard on the budget, and he, when he found shortfalls, he figured out what to do with them. I mean, all he did was cut budgets for the first few years in office. But here, Gessler kind of cut his own budget by accident, and now is complaining about it, not like a pig, but like a honey badger.
David, what's your take on the most recent issues with Gessler and the JBC?
Well, Lynn Bartles had a very solid article in today's Denver Post, and part of it explains that some of that fee cuts he did, he had to because the reserves were getting so large that it would have been unconstitutional for him to keep building them up. And I would say independent voters on the whole don't think a lot about the Joint Budget Committee, but people who follow the legislature closely know that the Joint Budget Committee is like the high honors class of the legislature. You take the six, among the six smartest people, conscientious ones who will work through those details, and they're on it. And there's a long bipartisan tradition of whoever each party puts on the Joint Budget Committee is going to be a pretty solid and well-informed person. So I think it does say a lot, at least to insiders, when Republican Sherry Giroux on the Joint Budget Committee is saying that Gessler's out of line.
A CDOT committee officially approved a 50-year contract with a private company to improve US 36 this week. CDOT came under heavy criticism for how the contract was handled, and 3 protesters at the final approval meeting were escorted out by police. Natasha, we saw how this played out last week. It was a mess. You think all we were missing, I think, were the pitchforks and torches. What did you make of it being passed so quickly?
Well, I think that the reaction to from the protesters is what most people think. It's a 50-year contract. It is not. There's not a lot of public information available, and that's what people are really protesting. No one seems to be too concerned with the idea that 36 needs to be fixed. I think there's consensus on that. I mean, we've gone from an area that was mostly farmland, not in the distance past, to an area that's completely built up, and not just from Denver to Boulder, but all the communities in between. There's so much housing being built up. There's so many commuters coming back and forth between the 2 major cities that all of this needs to be addressed. But having a little more transparency just rarely hurts. So why did they not do it in this case? I think that's a bigger concern.
Patty, does the quick move stop the bleeding or make it worse?
Oh, it just makes people more suspicious. We already have the lawsuit, and the fact that I don't know if they couldn't have postponed it a little longer, because remember, we didn't see the terms of the deal at all until 3 days before they did the final approval. Investors had already seen it when the public hadn't seen it. So they'd already had done the mea culpa last week that they needed to let people know about it. Maybe they didn't do a good job of communicating. Well, then they continue to do a bad job of communicating by not letting people know the terms sooner. 3 days on a deal this big to be able to look at the contract is just not enough.
David, will there be ramifications of how CDOT handled this?
Probably not, because there was a good article in Westword recently based on an interview with former Boulder Mayor Will Tour, who is a very strong enviro. And he says, and he explained, he went through all the objections that people have raised and explained why they're not really accurate. And so I think there's CDOT, it was wrong about how late it took for people to see what the full deal was. But I think you can also rely on people like Will Tour, and if he's going to say that it's a good deal, I think you can feel confident it actually was a good deal, even though it should have been put out to the public much earlier.
Penn, finish up for us.
There will be ramifications, because the issue here is not whether it's a good deal or a bad deal. It's not really whether you have to do something with 36. As we've talked about before, what matters here is how you treat people. And whether they want to acknowledge it or not, CDOT and the commissioners didn't treat this community very well. It's going to have an impact on the next major project they want to undertake in terms of process and substance. And the worst part of it is, if Will Tour is right, in that most of the objections are off the mark, that makes how this was handled even worse. Because what you're saying is, even when we're right, the impression you give is we don't care how you feel. So long as we're confident we're right, we're going to do whatever we want to. They may have reached the same decision, and it may have been cosmetic. They should have delayed this decision for a little bit of time. People still would have been agitated. They would have been worked up, but at least they would have had time to get through it, look at it, have more debate, and you can still make the same decision.
Let's quickly get to our favorite part of the show, Disgrace of the Week. Patty, start us off.
Workers at Rocky Flats nuclear weapons plant who are still, many grievously ill, many who've passed away from cancer that they have tied to their work with plutonium there, they are still trying to get compensation from the government. There are hearings in town this week, but it is definitely time that they get what they're due.
David.
The socialist fascist regime in Argentina, President Kirchner is destroying the democracy there, and her latest move has been to crack down on press freedom by breaking up the leading media organization which has been critical of her, Clarín.
Penn.
State Representative Libby Szabo, who has introduced a bill that even she acknowledges has no chance in the world of passing because she's upset over how the governor handled the Nathan Dunlap situation, trying to affect the governor's constitutional right to execute that pardon power. Just because you're a state rep and you're mad doesn't mean you get to introduce a bill and spend everybody's time in committee hearing how mad you are.
Natasha.
This is not new news, but the Russian stance on gay rights is just deplorable. And every night that I watch the Olympics, I'm reminded of it.
See something nice about somebody? Patty?
We drive up Welton Street every time when we come over to this studio, and yesterday the recipients of the Welton Street Challenge were just announced, and it looks like some very good revitalization of this street.
David.
The very brave people of Venezuela who are taking to the streets to protest the more advanced socialist fascist regime there, which after banning guns has imported Cuban thugs to teach local regime thugs how to murder protesters, which they've been doing at quite a high rate.
Penn.
Michaela Schifrin of Eagle Vale for winning the gold medal in the women's slalom.
Natasha.
I'm going to say Trader Joe's. I had a chance to go today. It was actually a lot of fun, and I love the Colorado products, particularly in the liquor store. It was nice to see some homestate pride there, too.
And you can't go wrong with $3 chuck and cookie butter. I mean, it's hard to go wrong. That's all the time we have tonight. Thanks for tuning in. For everyone here at Channel 12, I'm Dominic Dezzutti. Thanks for watching. Good night.